Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay.
Welcome, gentlemen. A lot has been happening around Afghanistan. There's a drawdown of troops, at least now, with the current president. Jim, what's going to be going on there?
Well, that's not a question that's answered very succinctly. The problem is that there are several players, as it were, major players. To boil it all down, it's the Afghan Taliban, the drug gangs, who are actually independent of, by and large, of the Taliban, and Pakistan. Oh, and then, of course, we have the Afghan government, which represents most of the country. The Afghan Taliban work for Pakistan, which is unpopular with most Afghans. They do this because some of them believe that eventually they'll be back in power. The vast majority of Afghans say that'll never happen, but everybody wants to avoid another bloodbath. We forget, as some people forget, that Afghan has been, well, at least until 2001, it was in a state of civil war since the late 1970s. Actually, if you want to, you can blame it all on the Russians. Before the Russian invasion in 79, Afghan, at least the urban areas, Kabul and a few other cities, were westernizing. Now, something that was missed by most foreign observers was that they represented less than 10% of the population. In fact, if you include those who were really enthusiastically westernizing, maybe 5% back in the 1970s. Now, this was radical change for Afghans, but as the Russians learned very quickly, the people out in the countryside were still very Islamic. Now, the big mistake the Russians made was that there had been a coup. Actually, there have been several coups, but anyway, first the king got booted, and there was a communist government, and that was overthrown. And at that point, the Russians said, "Look, we're so close. We'll just give it a little push." So they sent in troops. That basically united. It made the Russians realize two things. One thing the majority of almost all Afghans could agree on was they don't want the Russians. They don't want foreigners invading them again. The second thing they learned the hard way was there weren't that many communists. There weren't that many Afghans who were willing to back communism. And actually, the third thing they realized, which became sort of a running joke throughout the war, was when Brezhnev went to the Stavka, that's the Supreme General Staff in Russia, and asked them, how many troops can we support in Afghanistan? And the answer was like something 187,000. Now, this was done based on logistics. And the Russians knew about logistics in there because they had built the Salang Tunnel, which was a vital part of a highway between the north, where Russia was, and the south, which was Kabul and, most of the population was. And the Russians thought they were very clever. Well, we built a lot of the roads that didn't exist before, and we built the Salang Tunnel, so they had a lot of troops protecting the Salang Tunnel. But they found out there were not enough troops left over to police the entire country. And that's why the war kept grinding on and on and on. The Russians simply couldn't get enough troops in there. Now, they tried it with air power. They used some clever diplomacy. They basically won over some of the tribes to be neutral, not to be, pro-Russian. And that included a lot of the tribes, the non-Pushtun tribes in the north. And basically, it slogged on until the Russians finally. This was 1989, right about the time the Soviet Empire was collapsing from bankruptcy. That wasn't mentioned in the press release about them withdrawing from Afghanistan, but they quietly pulled out. They kept subsidizing the government they left behind, the government they'd established, which promptly found itself confined to Kabul and not much else. And all the rebel factions, the Pashtuns from the south and the various other Tajik and Uzbek and what have you, tribal warlords from the north, and they were basically fighting over who's going to get Kabul. And then Pakistan looked at all this, quite a bit of alarm, and said, well, we got to do something. Pakistan was where most of the, I think it was 4 or 5 million Afghan civilians fled to. And that was where Saudi Arabia basically helped fund a jihad. Now, the Americans, the CIA is blamed for all this, but the Americans supplied some of the more advanced weapons, but most of the weapons, and we're talking about basic stuff like AK-47s, ammunition, RPGs. This was bought and paid for by Saudi Arabia, and it was funneled through the Pakistani military and the ISI, which took a nice cut, and so they thought, hey, at least we're making money off this war. But it also meant that the Saudis were allowed to set up madrasas, religious schools, where all the instructors were the Wahhabi, the very, very conservative, sect which dominates Saudi politics, the place where no other religion may be openly preached or basically practiced. Where if a Muslim converts to another religion, it's a capital offense, and they enforce it. They behead people, every several hundred people or more in some years for disobeying one law or another, including sorcery. That's a no-no. So anyway, Wahhabism was introduced into Pakistan where it really hadn't existed before. And so that was something that a curse that Pakistan doesn't want to admit that it's fell prey to. The Afghans rejected it. They were never hardcore. They thought the Arabs were crazy. They may have had something in that. At least the ones that were in Pakistan and Afghanistan, included Osama bin Laden, who got the bright idea that, hey, I can take all these jihadis and I can start a global Islamic revolution and take over the world. They still believe that. Everybody got it wrong in Afghanistan. The Afghans just wanted to be left alone. They didn't want to be messed with. And this is a problem that's always been present in Afghanistan to this day. Now, one thing that came after the Taliban were turfed out, a measure of peace and enormous amounts of foreign aid brought a level of prosperity and other benefits like longer life. For a long time, Afghanistan had the lowest life expectancy in Eurasia. We were talking all of Asia and all of Europe. They're no longer that. I forget who's in first place now, but the standard of living went way up for everybody. Now, eventually, a lot of that was driven by the drug trade. Now, the drug trade, again, is a gift from Pakistan. The Chinese had basically shut down the drug trade in the Golden Triangle in northern Burma and Thailand and what have you by 1980. China, by the way, was the first major country which had a drug problem. That was back in the 18th century when China was prospering, and all this opium, not heroin, that hadn't been invented yet. That was a German invention in the 19th century. But opium, used to be a very expensive painkiller for the very rich who were ill, or if they were really decadent, not ill, they could just get high. But with the lower price for Burmese Golden Triangle opium and more prosperity in China, the Chinese government found its upper class, which basically ran the country. The next generation were all dope fiends. So they basically shut that down. They also got into an argument with the British over that, but that's another story. The Chinese finally shut that down with the cooperation of other countries in the area, and it moved to Pakistan, which was pretty much the Wild West. It seemed like a good place for the Golden Triangle to reestablish itself. Pakistanis didn't go for that, and they found out they could easily sort of nudge it into Afghanistan. And so by the early 1980s, the drug trade was booming in Afghanistan with the help of the Pakistani military, who had decided in the 1970s, or actually, in the late 1970s, to make unacknowledged support for Islamic terrorism a tool for fighting their enemies, mainly India, but also Afghanistan, anybody else they tried it on everywhere, but the only place where they're still at it is really in Afghanistan and India, which they're in big trouble for now, but that's another story. Actually, I think we read a bit today on that, on Pakistan's problems with not being blacklisted for being such blatant supporters of Islamic terrorism. And for a long time, people looked the other way in the West, especially. It was fashionable to blame the CIA for what happened in Afghanistan, and ignoring the fact that it's Saudi Arabia and Pakistan who are responsible for it. Now, in the last 5 years, Pakistan has come into the focus of everybody in the world who said, "You guys are what caused this mess, or are mainly responsible for it." And that is why, even though Pakistan continues to deny everything, unless they're a retired general, sitting in exile outside of the country, a lot of them admit, yes, we did a bad thing. And books have been written and what have you. Of course, now that's a capital offense in Pakistan to badmouth the military openly like that. But the FATA, the anti-terrorism financial organization, has since 2000 been basically telling countries to either shut down the money laundering and the soliciting of funds for criminals as well as Islamic terrorists, or you can't use the banking system anymore. The only two countries on the blacklist right now are Iran and North Korea. So you can see they're serious about this. Now, they have another dozen people on the gray list where Pakistan stood for a long time. China intervened. China's now mixed up in this because they basically been protecting. They've been simultaneously criticizing quietly Pakistan for their support of Islamic terrorism, because a lot of that translates into attacks on the nearly 20,000 Chinese workers in Pakistan right now, implementing over $100 billion in infrastructure investment China is making in order to make Pakistan a branch of their new Silk Road, as it were, their Belt and
Belt and Road Initiative.
Belt and Road Initiative.
BRI.
Anyway, that's proved to be a problematic, an overly ambitious project for them. But anyway, Pakistan stands to benefit an enormous amount. The problem with Pakistan right now is not only being found out as a supporter of international terrorism, especially in Afghanistan, but they're also bankrupt, because the army for years have been basically stealing more and more, not just getting an unusually large chunk of the budget, but they basically bullied their way into taking over or getting, percentages of major companies and what have you. And Pakistan is still technically a democracy. But India wisely, when these two countries split, they were basically similar in economy and everything else. The Indians went out of their way to eliminate feudalism. There was a lot of feudal landlords who basically kept their serfs, as it were, in poverty. That was part of their business plan. And India, to their credit, they bought them all out. And that's paid big dividends. But the other thing they did, which sort of backfired, was they instituted laws and procedures which made sure that the military would never take over the government, as they have done, continuously, not continuously, but periodically in Pakistan. Half the time since the Pakistan was created in 1947, the government has been taken over by the military for the good of the democracy or whatever. And basically that is wearing very thin with most Pakistanis. But because of the Saudi madrasas and the spread of Islamic fundamentalism, you have about 10-20% of Pakistanis are fanatic about their Islam. That was not always the case. I mean, they were passionate enough about it, their distinct identity as Muslim, Indians, to have their separate country. Of course, a lot of Pakistanis are saying maybe that wasn't such a good idea, because Bangladesh, which used to be East Pakistan, originally Pakistan was what is now Pakistan, and Bangladesh in the east, they were separated. Bangladesh was quite different. The only thing they had in common with the West Pakistan was they were both majority Muslim. But already the West Pakistanis were tolerating a lot more religious intolerance than was the case in Bangladesh. And when Bangladesh basically sought to become independent, West Pakistan tried to suppress it, and a million Bangladeshis got killed. The Indians intervened, so the Pakistanis still blame India for Bangladesh going independent, which is not true. And Bangladesh is doing much better, even though they have fewer natural resources than Pakistan, but they have a lot less, practically no Islamic terrorism. So you can see what the key element in all this is: the support of Islamic terrorism and the attempt by Pakistan to use it to control, to have enormous influence over whatever Afghan government there is. Now, they had a certain amount of control over the Taliban government that existed from 96, 97 up through 2001. But the thing that, again, a lot of people forget was that when we went into the support of Northern Alliance, which was still fighting the Taliban did not control the entire country, and more other countries were inclined to assist the Northern Alliance, Russia in particular. Now, the Soviet Union. Now it was Russia in the 1990s, and even though Russia was broke, post-Soviet Russia was broke. Once they got a few rubles together, they could spend elsewhere. They started talking to the Northern Alliance and said, "Look, we do not want a religious Islamic conservative government in Afghanistan," and that's one thing they and those Afghans in the north could agree on. Also, most of the Afghans, the Russians were able to bribe, coerce, whatever, into going neutral, were in the north, who wanted no part of this, tearing the country apart with another war with Russia. So here you have it. A lot of this has basically been non-news for decades, that Pakistan is the key factor in whether or not there's going to be peace in Afghanistan. And right now, Pakistan is giving no indication of going along with any peace deal that they do not control. And of course, another complication is you have the elected government in Afghanistan, who the Taliban didn't even want to talk to. Now they're at least talking to them. And the Taliban, of course, want a lot of concessions before they'll even talk to the government, to continue talking to us. We've released thousands of convicted and imprisoned, Taliban operatives. We've really got nothing to show for it. Now, the Taliban do have pressure on them, but it's not from the United States. It's from, on one side, Pakistan, and this has split the Taliban. Again, that's something you don't hear too much about. There's a guy named Rasul, a former heir apparent to the Afghan Taliban, now out in eastern Afghanistan, who has basically established his own, how should I put it, faction, that dissident faction of the Taliban, and is basically getting support from Iran. Now, Iran has no love of the Taliban. They hate the Taliban. But what they do like is anybody who will protect the 15% or so of Afghans who are Shia. In fact, the most recent proposal, this is news from Iran, is that they will basically finance and arm a Shia militia using thousands of Shia Afghans who went to fight in Syria as Iranian mercenaries. Over 10,000 of them did, and they were the best mercenaries they had. Most of the mercenaries were either Shia from Iraq or other countries in the region, and especially Afghanistan, where they basically went into the refugee camps and says, "Hey, look, you want a residency permit for your family?" Because they were expelling all the refugees as much as they could. And they said, sign up, we'll pay good, benefits, death benefits, health care. It's that usual 9 yards. Things these Afghans, only saw in Western movies. They said, really? And all we got to do is take a rifle and kill people? Hey, that's fine with us. And they did. But what Afghanistan has been worried about, the government and the Taliban, is that thousands of these have been coming home with combat skills and a certain sense of, we can fight this anti-Shia, activity, which is rampant now which was to a greater extent in Syria, because Syria forever, or at least since the 60s and 70s, was a Shia-run dictatorship in a Sunni majority. The population, about 85% of the population was Sunni. And the Assad family did it basically by balancing one faction of Sunnis and off against another, and basically it was a house of cards which eventually started coming down. But because the Sunni Islamic terrorists who took over the rebel movement couldn't agree among each other who was going to be in charge, they self-destructed. They're still fighting, but they lost. And one of the reasons they lost is because they had these Shia mercenaries from Afghanistan who were probably the best fighters on the government side, because these days, most Syrians in the Syrian army, even though they're on the winning side, they're better equipped, they're better armed, et cetera, they don't want to fight. I mean, they've been going on for almost a decade now. And it's very hard to get enthusiastic Syrian soldiers. You can get them in uniform, you can get them armed, you get them to training, but don't ask them to fight. That's why a lot of them are deserting. So the Assads still need foreign help, and even though they control most of the country, they can't really control it all, police it all, unless they have some outside assistance. So the Afghans are all over the place playing a key role, but they're basically at the mercy of Pakistan. So when you ask, is there going to be a peace deal with the Taliban in Afghanistan, you're asking the wrong question. The question is Pakistan going to basically pull the rug out from the Afghan Taliban, cripple the drug business, and basically bring peace to Afghanistan? Do the Pakistanis want that? Most Pakistanis would be fine, but the military has made it a reason for their existence and growing power that they must have some decisive control over what goes on in Afghanistan. The other thing they don't like to admit is that they're the ones who benefit from the bribes and the fees, as it were, that are paid to export the essential drugs, to convert opium into heroin, and also the ammonium nitrate, the fertilizer, which is now illegal in Afghanistan, facilitate that being smuggled into Afghanistan so the Taliban can make roadside bombs and what have you. So the army doesn't want to lose their cash cow here, but at the same time, that cash cow only works if they keep supporting chaos in a lot, especially southern Afghanistan, where the drug gangs and they're basically pistolero, Taliban have an enormous influence. So there it is. The question isn't will there be peace, but who has the decisive power. The only thing the Americans do is make it more difficult for another civil war to occur in Afghanistan, because the former Northern Alliance, which again that is an alliance of warlords and what have you, who are better organized, better motivated, not high on drugs. They're anti-drug. They have made it clear that they will not tolerate another, Taliban government. And if one arises, they will take help from wherever they can get it. And if that means Iran, which will be a headline one of these days, if it does come to that, people will say nobody knew. Well, anybody who wasn't listening to this doesn't know. How could that happen? It's already happening, and it's been happening for a long time. And India is also involved. Not only that, India and Iran got together and basically built a new exit, a new rail and road and sea outlet for Afghanistan until this new port was built. And it went live in the last 2 years. It includes a railroad, a road, and of course access to this port. India, I think, alone spent over $2 billion on it. The main primary and the most economical access to the outside world for Afghanistan was through Pakistan. Now Pakistan's lost that. Now that pains them no end, but they really can't say so. And the Afghans are basically feeling the ropes because they say, look, you haven't got us by the throat to the extent you had in the past. And, we can say no with some conviction. And the Afghans are saying no. And the Pakistanis in general are fine with that. They don't like being tied up one way or another in Afghanistan. The whole problem with Afghanistan is not Afghanistan. It's the tribes, the Baluchis and the Pashtuns, who together I think make up nearly 20% of the population. And the Pashtun territories, 2/3 of the Pashtuns in the world are in Pakistan. The other third are in Afghanistan. So, like you say, like if you look at it that way, the problem isn't Afghanistan; it's the Pashtuns, and the Pashtuns in Pakistan are trying to form a non-violent. Pashtuns are very violent people, so this is unnatural for them. But they realize the most likely way to get more political power and more freedom and more or less army, as it were, is to unite and basically make the world and Pakistan aware that the Pashtuns have had enough. They're not going to take it anymore. And of course, that the army quickly, classified the Pashtun, this movement as subversive, et cetera, and are using the usual thuggish techniques to try and put it down. But see, this is what Pakistan is basically up against, not Afghanistan, but the tribal separatists. The Baluchistans are especially separatists, and these are the ones that bother the Chinese more so than the Islamic terrorists, because the Islamic terrorists, the Chinese have a lot of help. Everybody can agree worldwide that the Islamic terrorists are bad, but the world is more divided over separatism. The Baluchis were never as violent and as much of a threat as the Pashtuns, or the Pathans, as the British call them. In fact, when the British left India, the arrangement with the Pathans, the Pashtuns in India, was that they had a degree of autonomy. They basically were ruled not by the colonial laws, but by tribal laws. And basically, the tribal chiefs, leaders, cooperated with the British to maintain peace. If there was a problem, the local British official would walk in there under a flag of, truce or whatever, hoping that he could survive it, because those flags didn't always work for foreigners. Maybe get a jirga. That's a meeting of the major muckamucks in the area. And that's how the Pashtuns would work out their differences. And the Pakistanis allowed that to continue. But what has happened, also since the 70s, that the new generation coming up, successive generations in the Pashtun territories, are basically less tied to the old ways. They see there's a better way, and that's what this new movement is all about. Basically the old tribal structure is at best, admired, but not really, it hasn't got the supreme power it used to have. And the younger generation says, look, we need a little more participation. The feudal tribal structure was fine, for a long time because that's all we had. But now there are alternatives. So there's a lot of chaos going in there. So it's not so much what happens in Afghanistan that's important. It's what's going on in Pakistan.
Dan,
Austin, your take on this?
I want to pick up on Jim's points about the Pashtun in Pakistan, and I'm glad he got to that. This is you'll look at a map of Pakistan, understand that some of the political components of this have changed really in the last few years, but the northwestern tribal lands, federated tribal lands, that strip of Pashtun tribal territories, duchies in some ways, are right along the Afghan border, and they're up in the mountains. Now, you go back 4 or 5 centuries, and these tribes would raid into the Indus River Valley, and even further than that. The Indus River that runs from the Siachen Glacier down to the Indian Ocean, but it goes right through Pakistan. And it was a problem for the Indians because Pakistan was not Pakistan, it was northwestern India. They happened to be Muslims there predominantly, but not totally. There were Hindus there as well. And you had to have some sort of security force as well as a political, diplomatic security force to stop the tribal raiders. India still sees this as a problem, but when it's not policed by the Pakistanis. The Pakistanis, after the division of India into Pakistan and India, suddenly didn't have the strategic depth that they had when they were part of India, and they're sitting there facing the mountain tribes. Now, over the last 70 years, Jim described that there's education, connection to Islamabad and Karachi. There's roads, there are schools, and you've had some change in the conditions of the Pashtun tribespeople in Pakistan. But there is that difference, and Jim's talking about some of the other divisions, problems of tribes in Afghanistan. But Pakistan faced the issue of its own Pashtun problem. And part of the way that the moderation, this is going to sound, well, I'll just go ahead and say it. Part of the moderation was the militarization of these tribal zones, the Pashtun, meaning the Pakistani army occupied them. Maybe not overtly, but they were there. And it was as much a security program as it was a pacification program. Still, Jim said it's the 2/3 versus 1/3. The other third of the Pashtuns are on the other side of the border in Afghanistan. Now, some of that's calculated. There is no greater Pashtunistan. There were some Indians that thought that was a good idea. It may no longer be a good idea, and maybe it hasn't been a good idea for 70 years. But that's part of the problem that Pakistanis wrestle with. It's not just the drug business. That throws money into it. It's not just Islamic extremism. Some of these tribes were in the raiding business, and they were Muslims, but they weren't fighting jihad. Jihad became another way to justify the mayhem. Now, Dan, one thing that when we decided we were going back to Afghanistan is Dan going to ask us how you fix it? And this is one of these problems that is almost unfixable. You've got that division with Jim talking about the Northern Alliance. There's a demographic difference. You've got Tajiks and Turkmen and several other tribes up in the northern areas of Afghanistan. Some of them have also moved into over time into the Kabul area. Kabul is kind of a hodgepodge because it's been the urban center of Afghanistan, but and Kabul has known periods, even since the American invasion in 2001, of relative calm and relative peace. But it is very easy to disturb that by firing a couple of rockets and setting off some bombs, which the Taliban figured out they could always get a headline by blowing up a car in Kabul. Jim's already addressed what that does to the rest of the Afghanis in the area. They hate it. They're tired, talking about being tired of war in Syria. Many of the Afghan tribes, and they spread out through the non-Pashtuns on this, have let it be known to the central government, such as it is, that, we could work this out if it weren't for the militancy of the Taliban. So that's part of what happened when you managed to get a open election. That the Taliban lost it. Some of them, said, "Well, we're going to we're not going to participate in electoral politics because of religious faith or whatever." But remember, the rest of Afghans overwhelmingly Muslim too, Shia as well as Sunni, and you got a statement, an open statement from 60% of the country, 65%. We really don't want to keep killing each other. But then you got the drugs, you've got Pakistan's interest, and you have got at least two hardcore Taliban factions that have differences between themselves. There are more than just two, but two main ones that get a benefit out of, as Jim said, keeping the chaos going. So I'm not sure how you solve this. I know that you have an international presence, and this is something that I have gotten some angry comments about when I've written this. Some sort of international presence in the Kabul area and in the other major urban areas has a positive effect on how do I want to put this? Has a positive effect, a reinforcing effect, favoring the tribes that want to stop open armed conflict. The thing is who provides that? The Trump administration said we're tired of Americans doing it, but we still want to be able to control the Islamic State, fight the Islamic State and Al Qaeda. NATO's had it there with its force, but why should NATO have to carry the burden on it? Who steps in, however, if you don't have NATO or an international force? China. China really doesn't want to, but China does want to have landlines of communication running through Afghanistan to Pakistan, because that's one way they get around the Indians' control. India basically controls the Indian Ocean just by its mere existence, and China is dependent on Southwest Asia and Africa for its natural resources to run its economy, industrial economy. That's part of what the Belt and Road Initiative land components are about, is reaching Southwest Asia along land lines, the new Silk Road. Well, part of that's going to run through Afghanistan. And the thinking is, are the Chinese going to police it? Now, ask the Russians if the Russians really think it's a good idea for the Chinese entering Afghanistan. The Indians don't think that's a good idea, and really the Pakistanis ultimately don't. The army may become a wholly owned criminal organization in hock to Beijing, but the people of Pakistan aren't interested in becoming a Chinese satellite. So who polices it? I'm open to ideas. Well, I've actually gone through all the ideas. You want the Russians? The Russians aren't going to come back, but they're not going to let the Chinese take it. And you do have NATO and a small American contingent there. Does it bring peace? No, it doesn't. And until you address, as Jim says, the problems in Pakistan, and some of them are, we can sit there and blame ISI and the military. They should be blamed. But some of it also goes back, as I'm describing, the tribal differences between the hill people and the valley people. You had the upscale, wealthy cosmopolitans living in the cities, only in this river, and then you had the armed tribes people looking down and saying, well, every so once in a while we need to come down there and steal some rubies. I'm putting it in figurative language. So I'm preempting you, Dan, asking what to do about it.
Okay. So, Jim, what effect is the drawdown going to have there in Afghanistan?
Well, it means less effective air support for the Afghans, who appreciate that air support. Now, we've been building up their air force, but it's minuscule compared to, I think they never supplied more than 10 or 15% of the air support missions that the Afghan security forces received. While the Afghans are making progress, the major problem is that there are not enough Afghans who can handle not just the piloting these aircraft, but maintaining them. Afghanistan still does not have an industrial infrastructure. Afghanistan has not gone through the Industrial Revolution. That's something we lose sight of. For example, Russia did not start going through the Industrial Revolution until a decade or so before World War I. And the communists made a lot of beaucoup propaganda on this, because they basically revived the Tsarist Industrial Revolution program, and all that industrialization in Soviet Union would have been done under Russia, no matter who was running the government, because it was underway. Well, it's never started in Afghanistan. They've increased literacy, and in Afghanistan, which used to be like 50% or something like that. I mean, it was atrocious. Most Afghans out in the countryside, they felt you need a couple of guys you can read to basically tell everybody else, or basically to read prayers, read the Quran, and that usually meant reading Arabic, not Afghan languages. They just didn't have the mindset to let's have an industrial revolution. Well, now a lot of Afghans say we need a Russian industrial revolution. They look around Afghanistan and say, how do I get out of this place? And that's why so many of the illegal aliens trying to get into Europe, mainly Europe and what have you, are from Afghanistan, is because these are people who are basically become wealthy enough to afford a people smuggler. You can't just start walking and get yourself into Europe or even close. You basically got to pay criminal gangs to smuggle you most of the way. that is basically the problem with Afghanistan. There are not enough Afghans. There are a lot of tribes. There are a lot of people who are in cities. They feel more of an affinity for the city, the whatever organization they're working for in the city, than they do for anything else. And the old Afghanistan, pre-1970s Afghanistan, worked because everybody recognized that. Afghanistan never existed as more than a region, as it were, until I think the late 18th, early 19th century. We reported on this with the exact dates, but anyway, the tribes got together when they saw that the British were closing in from the south, the Russians from the north, and of course they always had the Iranians. And they basically made a unprecedented agreement that they would form the Kingdom of Afghanistan. And says the most numerous tribes were Pashtuns. The king would always be a Pashtun, but the government jobs would basically be assigned in proportion to the various other ethnic groups and what have you. And the one important thing the king would do was deal with the foreigners, mainly keep them out. And any foreign money coming in, even then there was foreign aid, bribes, tribute, whatever, coming in. The king had to more or less, share it out, as it were. And he had the authority to call a grand jirga. Jirga was a tribal, peace, meeting, as it were, council. And these were called, usually per region and what have you, where several tribes were fighting each other. The king could intervene and basically call a jirga and try to preside. But all he did was, get the people together in the room, unarmed, as it were, to talk. And that often didn't work, and in which case they left and resumed fighting. But that provided Afghanistan with a degree of peace and less foreign intervention than they had seen in centuries. The country had basically been all these tribes, not just one Pashtun tribe, but dozens of Pashtun tribes, and almost as many other, Uzbek and the Tajiks and what have you, and some Baluchis. They basically were in their isolated mountain valleys, self-sufficient, which means they were very poor, but armed. And they would fight anybody who came in. And a foreigner was anybody who wasn't from their tribe. So they were basically moving very slowly towards national unity. But in the 1970s, when the Russians decided to send their communist propagandists into Afghanistan and try and form another communist republic, as it were, the Afghans rebelled before it could even get started. And the Russians were eventually expelled, which the Russian communists were very upset about that. Russians in general were basically not shrugging their shoulders. Well, good riddance. We should have been in there in the first place. Everybody knows the Afghans are nothing but trouble. In fact, it wasn't a joke during the Tsar's period that if some senior official was displeasing the Tsar, but not enough to be condemned as a traitor and executed, he would be appointed ambassador to Kabul. And that 50% chance he'd die in Kabul because there was no, diplomatic immunity as we know it today. And if the Afghans got how should I put it, angry at you, whether officially or unofficially, there was no one to protect you. The British discovered that to their peril and loss. So, the problem with Afghanistan is there is no Afghanistan. And what we have now is something that's barely holding itself together. It may take generations to basically form anything resembling, a nation state as exists in other parts of the region. India, Pakistan, even with the military domination, Bangladesh. There are a lot of even the Central Asian, the former Soviet stands, north of them. They have established relatively stable, should I put it, prosperous governments. Afghanistan has a lot of natural resources, but unlike all the states around them, they have no government that's powerful enough to guarantee peace. So foreign investors can come in, set up a mine or whatever, oil, gas drilling or what have you, and get their investment back, and of course have money for whoever steals it the fastest in Afghanistan. But the point is that sort of stability has not come to Afghanistan yet, and a lot of Afghanistans were very close. But I'd really like to observe it from somewhere else. So I mean, Afghanistan is in bad shape, and whether we're there or not has very little impact on it.
So, Austin, what's your feelings on the drawdown? And we'll wrap it up with that.
I want to make a comment on the Jim talking about the air power, and just quickly, I'll get to the drawdown. 2007, I was in Kabul, and I saw witnessed an aerial demonstration by the Afghan Air Force. The two pilots, were flying an old British Canberra bomber. Remember our B-57? Jim, I don't think I told you about this. And the pilot, knew what he was doing. I mean, he took the plane through some of its loops, swirls about Kabul, and then came in and landed at the international airport. And I happened to be there with some U.S. Air Force officers, and one of the officers told me, he says, they're really, in his opinion, his opinion, that Afghanistan had less, the Afghan Air Force, 10 competent pilots, maybe. And one of them was the pilot who'd been putting on the demonstration in the Canberra. Jim mentioned the issue of maintenance. Maintenance was being supplied by foreign contractors. There were some Afghanis who wanted to learn how to do it, but they were having to, entire skill set to operate aircraft. One of the things that happened when the Russians invaded, though, is that people with skills like that, who were tied to the government, they fled. Some of them, because they had skills, got to Europe. Even a few got to the United States. They lost, because of the Soviet attack, a cadre of what Jim talking about, industrial age skills. Some were developing, but the Russian invasion, they didn't co-opt them. Maybe didn't kill them all, but these people fled. So you lost. It's like losing all your high school teachers. You lost the group that could have made that transformation if they'd had 30 or 40 years of peace, which they didn't have. The Russians, too, another comment on this. The Russians in the 1970s thought they had the U.S. on the ropes because of Afghanistan. And remember the old warm water ports desire by the czars? Here was an opportunity to take advantage. The U.S. is on the ropes. The Indians don't like Great Britain, and they don't like the United States because the so-called U.S. favoritism of Pakistan and the 1971 war. And here was an opportunity to move in and take control. Take a region that would get them closer to the Indian Ocean. Now, utterly foolish, but that's them, the Russians in Moscow, believing their own propaganda and still trying to be Peter the Great, I suppose. It didn't end well. Now, what happens, Dan? What happens with this drawdown? There's so few U.S. troops there now. That's not. Jim said it's not making not going to make much difference. No, it does make a political difference. That's what I said about the utility of international security forces. It's is it symbolic? Yes, it's got to be strong enough to be able to protect the embassies in Kabul. It's the other element. Jim already touched on that. Air support, but also the logistic support. And can those be done by contractors and not military forces? Yes, but then you still have the problem of providing security for them. So I think a minimal, and this is where I've gotten the tough feedback on this. Gee, we shouldn't have anybody there. Well, then who's going to be there? Do you have any? Who will have any say over what goes on with the drug business? What goes on with the Belt and Road Initiative? Who remains in power? Because there are a number of Afghanis, particularly in the northern tribes, but also in the Kabul area, that want a relationship with Europe and the United States. And they're very suspicious, for good reasons, of Pakistan, Iran, Russia, and China. Do you just leave them there without any security or any relations? You just get up and leave. I think that sets a stage for even greater chaos. So how many? I don't know. I don't know the figure. I wish I did. But aren't we down, Jim? Aren't we down to about 5,000 or 6,000 now?
No, it's 2,500 now.
It's 2,500. Okay. Yeah, I don't know that one. I think it's 2,500. I was going to say 1,500, but no, I thought, no, wait a minute. But we've also got contractors there too. But it's that's the thing. So the logistics and maintenance force is larger than 2,500, but it's 2,500. All right, you got really 3 battalions. That's about what it amounts to. All right. That might be enough. It might be enough.
Yeah. We'll wrap it up there. Thank you, and we'll talk to you guys next time.
Bye, guys.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.